That was John Lennon with his version of Little Richard's Slippin' and Slidin' from his 1975 album of rock and roll covers called simply Rock and Roll. That album is at the center of a new book called Lennon, the Mobster, and the Lawyer, the untold story of how John Lennon took down a music industry gangster, by our guest today, Jay Bergen, attorney for John Lennon. In fact, Jay will be appearing at Rough Trade NYC this Tuesday at 6 p.m. Is that it?
Yes.
Rough Trade NYC is located at 30 Rockefeller Plaza, 6th Avenue, between 49th and 50th Street in New York City. He'll also be giving a presentation there, and we'll cover some of that material today. I think my audience is obviously very familiar with John Lennon. They might know a little bit about the circumstances surrounding the rock and roll album, but it's the involvement of Morris Levy that people might not know that much about. He was kind of leading a double life.
Well, in a way, David, it wasn't such a double life because everybody knew that from a very early age, Morris was involved with the mafia. I mean, you can go all the way back to 1949 when he established the jazz club on Times Square in 1949. He did that with mafia money. And then in the early to mid-50s, he started getting involved in rock and roll. He managed Alan Freed, who was kind of this DJ that came in from Cleveland and kind of set the world on fire, because I remember I was in high school at the time, from 51 to 55, and Morris went on from there to found Roulette Records, I think it was 1956, and also latched on to and opened a couple of publishing companies. So by the time 1975 rolled around, Morris had a wide reputation as being hooked in with the mob. I mean, everybody in the music business knew it. Certainly, everybody in New York City knew it. I mean, one of his partners was Tommy Ryan Eberly, who was a high-ranking member of the Genovese crime family, and he was a silent partner, I believe, in either Roulette Records or one of his other smaller record companies, and maybe even in the music publishing. I mean, it was, I don't know whether you've ever read Tommy James' book.
Yes.
There were stories in there about how if you just dropped into Morris's office sometimes, some of the guys, the wise guys, would be hanging out there. And Thomas Eberly, his nickname was Tommy Ryan because he was a fighter in his youth. But in 1971, he was gunned down coming out of his mistress's house in Bensonhurst and shot 5 times in the face. And that was the start of a mafia war that over the next couple of years, there were 15 or 16 members of various families that were in New York City who were murdered or disappeared. So Morris he was a bad guy.
Yeah. So it's through music publishing that John Lennon ran afoul of Morris. Is that correct?
That's correct. Morris, in fact, about 10 minutes ago, I had in my hand the complaint that Morris's company, Big 7 Music, filed in the federal court in Manhattan in 1970, claiming that Come Together infringed the Chuck Berry song, You Can't Catch Me, which I've heard stories that Morris somehow scammed that song away from Alan Freed, who was a disc jockey, as I mentioned before, and who got caught in the payola scandal of the late 50s, early 60s, and kind of got really in deep trouble. So Morris claimed that the lyrics, Here Come Old Flat Top, and Come Together, infringed the Berry song, which said, Here Come a Flat Top, and Chuck Berry was talking about, in his song, a convertible that came by him on the Jersey Turnpike one night John was talking about a man who used to have a crew cut,
Right.
also called a flat top in those days, and then had hair down to his knee. He became a hippie. And the complaint is like 3 pages long. And the exhibits that are attached to prove the infringement are a couple of pages of Berry's lyrics, the sheet music, and 1 page of the Lennon sheet music from Come Together. So he sued both Northern Songs and the other Beatles publishing company, and John wrote the song, so he was responsible for defending it. And nothing really much happened in the case for 3 years until October of 1973, when John was just beginning to record what he called his Golden Oldies album, which became John Lennon Rock and Roll, with Phil Spector in Los Angeles. And Morris Levy's case was about to come to trial, and John said, I can't, I'm working now. You just do something. Get rid of it, settle it. So the settlement, I think, that was negotiated by Harold Sider, who was his business manager at the time, was that John would record 3 of Morris's songs on his next album, which everybody anticipated was going to be the rock and roll album.
So how do you get into the Lennon orbit?
Well, when John and Ringo and George left Alan Klein in 1973, John was looking for a lawyer in New York, and this Harold Sider, who was John's business manager, who lived in California, in Los Angeles, he, through another friend, mutual friend, he recommended David Dalgenis. So David was then, in 1973, representing John, and mostly in connection with the dissolution of the Beatles partnership, which took, I'm sure you and your listeners know, just took years of negotiation to finally resolve. And I had handled a couple of small litigation matters for John, and in February of 75, David Dalgenis called me down to his office and said, look, can you go to a meeting this afternoon at Capitol Records? This guy, Morris Levy, is threatening to release, a pirated album of this John Lennon album that he's working on. So I said, sure, I'll go to the meeting. I think it was 5:00 in the afternoon, and there were 2 lawyers there from Capitol and another lawyer from the West Coast, from Capitol's offices. And they were kind of filling me in on these rumors they'd heard. And all of a sudden, the conference room door opened, and in walked John Lennon. And to say that I was stunned,
Sure.
an understatement, because I had no idea he was going to be at the meeting. I'm not even sure the Capitol lawyers knew.
So how did Morris Levy get the tapes in the first place to release a pirated album? Was that through nefarious means as well?
Well, if you jump back into 74 for a minute, Morris kept kind of harassing John about, I want to hear my songs, because he knew that John had brought his band in, the same band that recorded Walls and Bridges in the summer of 74. He brought them in New York in October and did the basic tracks for completing the Spector album. But he also knew that the album wasn't finished at the time. He was still working on it. And finally, one of the things I learned about John is when I represented him there was he found it very hard to say no to people. And Morris kept kind of hounding him. And finally, John said, all right, what do you want? And Morris said, I just want to listen to it in my office, so can I have a reel-to-reel? So John called the record plant, asked them to make 2 reel-to-reels, because that's what it would take. And they were a rough mix of the album. It was only at 7.5 IPS, inches per second, so it wasn't finished. The finished album, as you know, would have been 15 IPS. And that was a terrible mistake, because once he gave that unfinished rough mix to Morris had the ability to put it out. So let's jump back forward to February 5th when I met John, and John knew he had that. He knew he made a mistake by giving it to him, and this is what he was worried about, because it wasn't the finished product, and he had done a lot of work on it after the recording sessions in October of 74, and he said, my fans are going to hate it. This is just going to be terrible. It's going to be awful. So there was some talk about trying to get an injunction to stop Morris, and I finally convinced Capitol and John that we don't want to start the litigation. Litigation is kind of like a war. If you fire the first shot, you don't know what's going to come back. So I finally said to John, how long will it take you to finish the album? And he said, I can go in tomorrow. This was February 3rd. I can go into the record plant tomorrow and I can finish it in 2 days. And I asked Capitol, how soon after John turns it over to you can you release it? And the Capitol lawyer from Los Angeles said, in a week, 2 weeks, maybe less than 2 weeks. So John said, I'd rather do that. I'm really sick of this album. It's taken me longer to complete this album than any other album I've ever worked on. So that was the decision. A couple of days later, Capitol learned that Levy was starting to buy time on TV stations around the country, because he was going to sell the album on TV through his company, another one of his companies called Adam 8 Limited. Where you send in your $4.98, right, and they'll send it to you in the mail.
Now, Adam 8 presents one of the
Here's how to order.
On January 30th, after Harold Sider told Morris that, there's no way that Capitol was going to let this be released on TV, Morris insisted that he come to his office and to discuss this. And when Harold got there to his office, Morris turned around, turned on the tape recorder in back of him, and all of a sudden, Harold was listening to John Lennon sing, "You Can't Catch Me." And Morris said to him, started screaming and yelling at him and cursing, and he said, I'm going to put it out. I got a shot. I've got a shot. And then said to Harold, do you want to call Capitol? So what Morris was really doing, he was a grifter. Morris was one of these people who, he was very smart and very bright, but he's one of those people, if he could do something illegally, he'd rather do it illegally than legally.
Right.
So he says to Harold, do you want to call Capitol? In other words, tell Capitol what I'm going to do, and maybe we can do a deal. Harold got up and walked out of the office. He knew what was going on at that point.
Well, it's Saturday. WFDU FM.
We're back talking with attorney Jay Bergen about his book, Lennon, the Mobster, and the Lawyer, the untold story of how John Lennon took down a music industry gangster. And again, he will be at Rough Trade NYC this Tuesday at 6 p.m. for a Q&A and a book signing. And I had heard this rumor from another guest actually on the program that John, despite this lawsuit with Morris Levy, kind of enjoyed Morris?
Well, he thought he was a character.
Yeah.
Because, Morris liked to talk about himself. He kind of talked with a raspy throat because he claimed he had polyps. And it's not that they liked him. I mean, John actually testified, well, we weren't friends. I thought he was a character. But, John also, when I interviewed Klaus Vormann in Los Angeles just before the trial in October of 75, Klaus told me that John is very naive about business. It's not his thing. He would talk to Klaus about, maybe I should do an album with Bob Dylan. not even thinking that, well, Dylan is with one record company and he's with another record company. How are you going to do that? So, so he was kind of naive about the business side of things, and he didn't want to learn anything about the business side.
Well, folks can check out the book to see how the trial played out. I mean, you can guess it was a success for you both. And how was John in a courtroom situation?
He was the best witness I ever had. We spent a lot of time getting him ready to testify. He and Yoko came to every day of the trial, 20 days, spread over several months. And he was there even on days when he did not have to be there to testify. Morris Levy was not. Morris realized his case was in trouble, I think, early, and he did not show up very often. But John and Yoko were there every day. They were great. They were very supportive to me, particularly John, because he listened to my advice, and we got along very well.
Would you say you developed a friendship during that time?
Well, we weren't buddies, so we weren't hanging out together. I mean, any time we were together, it was somehow in connection with the case. But we did develop not only a good relationship in terms of he was the client and I was the lawyer, but we had a kind of friendship. The first day of his deposition, when they took his deposition in May of '75, we went to the lunch break, and I said to John, well, let's go over to Grand Central Station, and we'll have lunch in the Oyster Bar. And he said, oh, well, I've never been in Grand Central Station. And I said, well, you're in for a treat, because this is an architectural wonder. And we walked in off of the west entrance, and he stood there on the balcony, the west balcony, and looking over the room. You know the room, and it's a spectacularly beautiful with the ceiling and everything. And we then went down onto the floor, and he walked around. The information booth is kind of right in the middle, the round information booth, and nobody bothered him. I don't know whether they didn't recognize him or what, but he walked around for a while, and then we went downstairs to the Oyster Bar, and he whispered in my ear, he said, Jay, see if we can sit against the wall. So I asked the maitre d', can you put us over against that wall? And when we got to the table, John asked me to sit with my back to the wall so that I'd be facing the other diners, and he would be facing me.
Right.
So, and then, we talked about the case. We talked about, we had a conversation, I remember, about the history of Grand Central Station. And after, I took him over to see the lobby of the Chrysler building, which was just on the next block east. And the next day, when the deposition was over, we were walking up Park Avenue on the east side, and all of a sudden, this middle-aged woman stopped in front of us and said, "You're George Harrison." And and John said, "Yes, I am. Thank you." And she stepped aside, and we continued walking, and we really started laughing. David, if she had asked for an autograph, he would have given one.
Right.
Given one to her, but I'll bet money he would have signed George Harrison.
Right. And she probably would have been thrilled.
Yeah. Right. And John had one rule about autographs. I'll give anybody an autograph, but not while I'm eating. That was the rule.
That sounds reasonable.
Yeah. He was just chilled out and, waiting for the birth of Sean, which happened 3 months before the trial started. And in January of 1976, that's when the trial started. So he was just a man. That's all. Just a person who was waiting for the birth of his child, and not allowing Morris Levy to bully him.
And once again, as we start to wrap up here, you're going to be appearing at Rough Trade NYC for a Q&A and book signing, and that's at 30 Rockefeller Plaza.
Yes, I am on the 23rd of August between 6 o'clock and 8 o'clock. And Bob Gruen, who wrote the foreword to my book, who was a very close friend of John and Yoko's, he's going to be there with me.
Very, very interesting conversation. I want to thank you so much for appearing on the show. And again, the book is available. Well, I guess where would be the best place for, I mean, aside from the signing, obviously, but for folks who might not be in New York City at that time or listening to this in another part of the country, where would the best place to get it online be?
Well, you could go to my website, which is www.Lennon, the Mobster, and A-N-D, the lawyer.com. And, of course, I guess, you could always also go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble. It's been on Barnes & Noble and Amazon for quite a while. So if people can't make it to Rough Trade at 30 Rockefeller Plaza, they can get it through my website.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bergen. You have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.